Hi, this is Greg McRae, founder and CEO of Foundation Group, and welcome back to our 501c3 University channel, where we strive to make nonprofit issues understandable. Today, we're taking a look at some questions and giving some answers from viewers to our channel. Well, today we're doing something a little bit different. We get questions from clients and from viewers to our channel all the time, and sometimes these are submissions on our website, people asking general questions about their nonprofit, how to do things better. Sometimes it's in response to actual videos that we produce, but either way, we occasionally want to try to get to these. These are obviously going to be less scripted videos, and today we picked three. We're not always able to get back to these, but these are three that came in recently off of our website, and it's three different topics. We want to cover issues about some nonprofit board situations, board of directors situations. One question is touches on some private benefit things. It also touches on some board issues. And the third question deals with restricted funds. So we'll kind of jump in here. The first question is about nonprofit boards, and Brandon writes, for the nonprofit quorum, it says, and I'm presuming he's talking about an article on our website, for the nonprofit quorum, it says a quorum is the minimum number of unrelated board members needed to count as an official meeting. So what is the minimum number? Is it just a majority or a majority of unrelated members? That's a great question. And oftentimes this is confusing, especially when it comes to public charities, as to what defines a quorum. Well, generally speaking, a quorum is defined as the minimum number of board members that are required to legally conduct a meeting. But what is that minimum number? And that goes to Brandon's point. I want to read another question from Ann because it goes kind of to the same thing before we get into this. So Ann writes, I am president of a nonprofit volunteer fire company. We recently had an issue with 3 of the 5 members of our board holding a meeting claiming it was a quorum, although 2 of the 3 are mother and daughter. We found a post by you stating that the relationship would deny the validity of the meeting because of that relationship. The 3rd member at that meeting feels your article doesn't hold water because it's a blog. Can you shed light on this issue for us? Well, we're certainly going to try. So when we're talking about quorum, we said already that a quorum is the minimum number of people necessary to be able to legally conduct an official board meeting. So in a public charity setting, we already know that the IRS expects that a majority of the board, at least a simple majority of the board, is unrelated by blood, marriage, or outside business ownership. So what does that look like here in the case of setting up a quorum? Maybe you've got 7 board members, maybe only 5 of those board members or 4 of those board members are able to show up to a board meeting. What happens if a majority of that number that does show up is related? Well, that gets into a very murky situation here because for the most part, typically speaking, if you look at the bylaws of an organization or you even look at state law as it relates to nonprofit boards, you're going to see that a quorum generally is defined as a majority, at least a simple majority of the board members present. Very rarely will you see it stipulate anything about the relationships between those members when the quorum is present. So let's take Ann's situation. They have 5 board members, 3 show up for a meeting, but 2 of the 3 are related. So they satisfy the definition of quorum by it being a majority of the board present. But do they satisfy a quorum? Do they have a legal quorum in place, given that 2 of the 3 members are related? Well, that's a great question, and it's not clear. The reality is, if they're doing any business in that meeting or voting on anything in that meeting that directly affects that mother or daughter, then they don't have sufficient independence at that meeting to conduct business. If they are not doing business at that meeting that directly affects the mother and daughter, then chances are they have satisfied the legal definition of quorum enough to hold that meeting. Is that a best practice? I would say that it's not. In general, we would want to see that for those that are showing up for an official board meeting of a public charity, that the majority present itself has a majority of unrelated or independent individuals. I think that's just best practice. But in the case of Ann, with the mother-daughter situation, I think it's really going to depend on whether or not that the business being conducted affects them personally. If it does, then I think you've got an issue there. So the next question goes into kind of a similar situation. It starts off dealing with a board issue that's similar, but it goes into something quite different, and it goes into private benefit and inurement, which has been a topic that we've been talking about recently. So Christy writes, I recently started doing bookkeeping for a Christian camp in Oklahoma that is a 501c3 public charity. I've been told the way it's being operated goes against IRS regulations. The board is made up of the director, his wife, and 3 kids. I understand from reading articles that this is not allowed. So let's stop there. There's more to this question. We'll get to that in just a minute. So the first question is, they've got a public charity in Oklahoma. It's a Christian camp, but all of the board members are directly related. So the director, his wife, and 3 kids. Is that against IRS regulations? It is not against the letter of the law. I want to make that clear. Is it against the spirit of the law? Absolutely, because in a situation like this, the IRS, again, expects the majority of the board to be unrelated by blood, marriage, or outside business ownership. In this case, this is one family. This is one nuclear family serving on the board together. So is that a problem? Well, it is a problem because it is virtually impossible for that board to conduct business at arm's length because there is no independence whatsoever. This is a board that is far more reflective of a private foundation than it is a public charity. I would say that even if you could make the argument that this squeaks by legally for a public charity, there's almost no way for it to conduct business legally. And as we read the balance of the question here, I think you're going to see that and why that is. So the balance of the question, Christie goes on to say, the director has a sole member LLC for rental houses and has been using ministry funds to purchase houses. He takes loans from ministry funds for his LLC as well. He says the rent income is to fund the salaries of ministry employees, but he owes so much debt to the ministry that the rent is swallowed up by that. I've read about inurement and would like to know if this goes against IRS regulations. About 16 ways to Sunday, this goes against IRS regulations. There's no way this passes muster. And this goes back to the first half of that question, talking about the relation between the board members. This is why a board setup like this can never work. Number one, there's no independence on the board, but number two, they're involved in some serious self-dealing. This has inurement written all over it. In fact, this is so extreme that the IRS would likely both penalize the organization and quite likely revoke their tax-exempt status. We get lots of questions, lots of scenarios thrown at us about situations like this. This one is extreme. So let's take a look at this. So the director has an LLC for his rental property activity. He's taking loans from the ministry to buy houses for this LLC rental property activity. So let's stop right there. Can a director take a loan from a nonprofit? Well, in the vast majority of states, that answer is no. It is strictly against the law in the vast majority of states for a nonprofit to lend money to what's called a disqualified person. Take a look at our videos on disqualified persons. That's officers, directors, key employees, related family members, substantial contributors. Those are all disqualified persons. So a public charity lending money to, actually any 501c3 lending money to a disqualified person, that's against state law in just about every state. So problem number one. Number two is that he's using those loan funds to do personal business, and then he's not able to pay it back. So he's borrowing this money because he obviously doesn't have enough to do it himself, and the rental activity apparently is not enough to even completely pay back the rent. So is that inurement? It's obviously inurement. I would even go so far to say that it borders on embezzlement because these are publicly donated funds and there's zero independence on this board. It would be against state law if they had a 100% independent board and the board had voted to allow this lending activity to take place. In a situation like this, where you have zero independence on the board, this is all family run, and this family is lending money to itself through this organization, I would tell you in most situations this would actually be seen as embezzlement. This could be criminal activity. So interesting questions that we get from people who view our channel and who read our content on our website. I feel bad for these guys. Christy, that is doing the volunteer bookkeeping for them, has stumbled upon a mess that I don't even think she fully appreciates how big a mess it is. All right, issue number 3, we're going to talk about restricted funds. Now, that's been a topic that we've talked about quite a bit lately, so check out the links to the video below, maybe one or more that's going to pop up around here, about restricted funds. And again, what is restricted funds? Restricted funds are donations that are given by a donor where the purpose is there's strings tied to it. So the donor has restricted the use of those funds. So Zach writes, I work at a nonprofit that recently purchased a property with a building which we are renovating into a studio and broadcast headquarters. So far, so good. The property was purchased with about half of the money coming from the building fund and about $300,000 borrowed from operating reserves. And he actually put borrowed in quotes. The board made the decision to garnish 50% of future donations designated building fund to pay back the internal loan. This was a compromise with the volunteer bookkeeper who wanted to pay back the internal loan in full before spending any building fund money on the remodel project. The existence of the internal loan was not widely publicized, and no public updates on the progress of paying this loan have been made. Is this type of practice considered an appropriate use of designated funds? Great question. It's a complicated situation here, but we see this sort of thing all the time. So let me kind of break down what's happened here. Zach's nonprofit that he works at, they already had a designated account where they were storing up money for their building fund purposes. People had been designating money into this, so they had a set-aside fund that already had restricted funds in it. So it sounds like that they liquidated that fund, they exhausted that to buy the building and to begin the renovation work, but that wasn't enough. And so instead of taking a loan out from a bank or something like that, they took $300,000 from operating reserves, and they're saying that they borrowed that from operating reserves, and which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. They can use non-designated funds for that purpose. They had used everything they had in the designated account. But what's happened now is the board has decided that they want to replenish that $300,000 that was borrowed from general operating funds, and so they're going to garnish. Or in other words, if I donate $1 to their building fund and I restrict those funds and I designate that over to the building fund, they're going to take 50 cents of that dollar and as a way to replenish that general fund balance that they borrowed from. Can they do that? That's Zach's question. Well, no, not really. Without extreme transparency here, they're violating the principle of restricted fund giving. If a donor gives $1,000 to the building fund and they have strictly said that this is going to be a restricted gift only for the purpose of the building fund, they can't just arbitrarily take 50% of that and move it to operating reserves because they've technically borrowed from that fund. That's not the public's concern. The fact that they used half of the money that they needed, or they took half of the money they needed from operating reserves, that's not the donor's issue. You would have to have extreme transparency on this issue, explaining to the donors that half of what they're giving is really going to go back to replenish. Now, you could try to make the technical argument that because money was taken from the operating fund to pay for this, to pay for the building fund expenses, that this is still technically using that money for building fund purposes. I would say that that's not the case because this is an after-the-fact situation. They've already spent the general operating funds. The fact that they've got a technical deficit, that's their choice to consider that a deficit. That's not anything they're legally required to do. That's not an accounting requirement. There is no requirement whatsoever that they would pay back the operating funds. If the board wants to do that, they can replenish those operating funds, but they can't do it by garnishing, that's a great use of the word here, garnishing designated funds, because the donor's intent needs to be respected here. So I would say that this is not an appropriate use of designated funds. But this just goes to show how complicated this stuff can get. We talk about these things in videos all the time from more of a sterile point of view, more of a situation agnostic view. We kind of give the 30,000 foot view of here's this rule, and this regulation. Here's best practice. Make sure you do this. But the reality is when you start dealing with actual client issues, these issues are complicated. They're not easy to figure out. And there's a lot of different facts and circumstances that comes in here. And every situation's different. We have a joke around our office that the answer to every question is, it depends. And it does. We even have t-shirts made up that says, it depends, with the company logo on the back. And the reason it's a private joke to us, it's not funny to anybody else, but it's funny to us because literally every client situation that comes up, whether it's the 15th question we've dealt with today about inurement or the 25th question we've dealt with this week about board makeup, the facts and circumstances that each client brings to the situation is a little bit different. So Zach's question is a great one. Is this an appropriate use of designated funds? I don't think it is. Thanks for watching. We're going to do some more of these Q&As as time allows. If it inspires you to ask some questions in the comment section, go ahead and do that. We're going to get to these as often as we can. It won't be super frequently, but I hope it's helped you out. Thanks for watching. Now go serve your community. Hey, do me a favor and don't navigate away just yet. We would really appreciate it if you would hit the like button below, as it really helps get our content recommended to more people. Subscribe if you haven't already, as we have great content coming your way on a regular basis. Finally, you can click the little bell icon to be notified of new content when we post it. To learn more about Foundation Group, you can visit us on the web at www.501c3.org. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.